Hello, my name is Chris. I run GamesIndustry.biz and welcome to GI Sprint. This is our new series of articles, videos and podcasts all about making video games cheaper, faster and better. We're covering technical areas with things like AI and cloud, but we're also going to be covering processes, communication, team alignment and how to sort of get things right at the concept stage. And it's that last bit that we're covering today. And to discuss it, I'm actually joined by a real expert in this, the founder of Team Sync, Graham McAllister. Hello, Graham. How are you?
Hi, Chris. I'm good, thank you. Yourself?
Yes. Well, I'm excited to have you on because you're always, so every time we bring you into anything, whether it's a talk or a bit of advice on Best Place to Work Awards, it's absolutely fascinating. But actually, you do have quite a unique job. Tell us about it.
Yeah, it's probably a one-of-one job, I think, in the games industry. So I guess the area I fall under is called organizational psychology, which is the science of team performance. What makes one team perform well, what makes another team perform not so well. We might get into this. But the particular problem I work on is team alignment. So you could think of this as, if you get a team together, is the whole team making the same game or multiple games? And what I mean by that is in their head, are they all working towards the same goal or different goals? So that's the problem that I work on. I could talk more about that if you want, or do you want to, have you got a burning question?
I guess we'll explore it in I guess, we're talking. So what is, you must go into studios a lot then. Studios must need this. So what is going wrong in studios?
Yeah, so when I first got into this problem, so I'm about 5 years into this journey. As we're talking now, I started working on this problem in 2019. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, and it was kind of the Anthem article that made this popular. So when that Kotaku article hit by Jason Schreier, and he investigated, what went wrong with Anthem, and the staff anonymously were talking about their version of what happened. And they said, yes, there was many things went wrong, and most people have read that if you're in the games industry. But they said the root cause of that problem was we had no clear vision. And the root cause was we did not actually know what we were making. So some people had one idea, other people had another idea, and this is essentially the issue I'm working on. I was already working on that problem for a few months. I was only a few months in when that article hit. And so I was like, well, that's interesting. This problem that I've seen in my previous career in the game industry is now being cited as, the lead cause of failure in this high-profile game. So I'd be looking into other evidence. Is this true? Is this true on a bigger scale? Not just Anthem, but is vision alignment important to the success of a team? And if so, how important is that? So the more I looked into it, the same answer kept coming up. It's the most important thing a team can do to be successful. By the way, that just means the team is successful. It doesn't guarantee riches and all the rest of it. And because you could have a bad idea, but the team are aligned on it. So we have to separate these problems out, right? But in terms of if we've got a good idea for a game and we believe the idea is good, and the leading reason why that game is maybe spending too long in production, or the team is wasting too much money, or they're burning, human motivation, people are getting burned out and things like that. The root cause of all of these types of problems is we're actually not interpreting the vision of the game in the same way. And I'm fascinated with why that is. What is the human psychological process that causes that to happen? So I spent 5 years on that one trying to understand that at a deeper level.
And is it that the stuff that's leading to, because when you see, does that mean as a result of this, when you see a game gets cancelled or a studio gets shut down or the game doesn't hit its financial targets, your brain is going, I can see where what went wrong there.
I do collect these articles, as you would imagine, because I'm interested in gathering different types of evidence. One is evidence we see in the game industry. It's hard to get to the truth, by the way, because if a game underperforms, we won't see everything as outsiders. We don't know the decisions that were made. We don't see any internal conflict or tensions between different parts of the studio. But the same story keeps emerging. I also look at academic evidence as well, so large-scale studies around what makes teams perform. But yes, this keeps coming up essentially. We can get into the Anthem was the one that's first made it public saying vision is a problem here. Why I was working on the problem is in my previous role in player psychology, I had seen that hundreds of times. I visited lots of game studios in my prior jobs, and so I've seen this play out. If I was walking around a studio and I'm maybe speaking to a creative director and I'd say, tell me about your game, and maybe I go down to someone in design or production or whatever it might be, and I ask the same question, what game are you making? It'd be very common to get a different answer from different parts of the team. I always find that fascinating, which is why have they interpreted, it's difficult to say, the vision of their game in a different way? What's going on there? And so when you look at the science behind that, the organizational psychology, it's called shared mental models. We'll get to the details in a second, but when you look into this, it explains why we have this problem as humans. It's a human problem. It's not necessarily design, although that's a part of it, but it's all these factors coming in. But yeah, you're quite right. Go back to your question. This is a common repeating pattern, and the consequence, the outcome, I would say, is when you see studios closing or people losing their job. This problem we're talking about today is often the root underlying cause of why this is happening. So why are you wasting $100 million? We could talk about hyenas. Or Square Enix said they just wrote off $140 million. They have to get that back somewhere, right? And the consequence may be, well, we'll close something, or we'll not invest in this other game we were about to make, or there's going to be a consequence to this. And my view is this is kind of preventable. I think so anyway.
I think my problem is if I was ever, I changed my vision for things. I know you could ask me today what's the vision for GI Sprint, and I'll tell you a different one tomorrow. That's not true. But there is always, I always find myself, I guess, getting vision alignment is not always across teams. It's probably with yourself, making sure that you know what you're making, and stick into that. So let's talk about this. What can be done about this? What can the studios do?
Well, that's tricky. So when I was looking into this, well, first of all, say why it's a problem. Because, so the short version is when I was looking into why is this a problem, and we'll talk about it, what I was expecting to happen is I would keep reading in this academic literature around why do people find it difficult? Why does a team find it difficult to align on a vision? I thought I would eventually get to the literature that said, here's the solution. And I would think, brilliant, we'll just apply this to the game industry and we're done. I honestly believe that was the solution. But there's lots of work and research saying this is the problem, and we now understand the problem. What I could not find anywhere, you can see what's coming, right? What I couldn't find was, and here's how to solve the problem. It didn't happen. There are even some books called Finding Your Vision and stuff like that, but they repeat all the methods that the game industry has, which are proven not to work, which is we keep talking about it, we repeat it as often as possible. So those things by themselves are not going to fix the problem. So let's take a step backwards then. Why isn't there a solution to this? And we'll combine that in with what's the actual problem. So this area of science we're in, the sub-branch of like organizational psychology we're in here is sometimes called shared mental models or team mental models. So I prefer team because we talk about teams in the games industry. So a mental model is the idea you have in your head. So if I've got an idea for $1 billion game, and I'm going to tell it to you, I'm very generous, I'm going to give you my $1 billion idea for a new video game. As a vision, let's say, holder, imagine I created this idea. I've got an idea in my head of what we're about to make. Maybe I've written it down, maybe it's in my head, but I need to communicate it to someone. Problem number one is it's very hard to capture the idea. In other words, this is called the level of the mental model. The amount of detail that I put in describing the problem is often incomplete. So I wasn't captured sufficiently to begin with. It's an incomplete model. And so when I tell it to you, you form a model in your head of what you thought I would want to make. So you've got a copy of a copy. I've got something in my head which is incomplete and partial, let's say. But I tell that to you, and you form a model in your head of what you thought I had in my head. So this is a copy of a copy. And this permeates and progresses throughout the whole team. Imagine you've got a team of 200 people, and that idea goes on down the line. The chance of that vision being created by every single, interpreted the same way by every single person is very, very unlikely to happen. But what I wanted to know is, prove it. Because if I ask a team and say, are you aligned on your vision? Some teams say yes. Some of them have even said we're good at that. That's our strength. We're very good at communicating the vision. And so I created this thing called the vision alignment check, which says let's bring the proof into that. So this mental model is, whenever we think of a game, an idea comes into our head. So if you're playing Helldivers 2 or something, an idea comes in your head of what that game is. And so each person in their head has an idea of what the game may be. My job is to say, what's that image in your head? What is that thing? And if I can extract that from your head and compare it, I will find the variation. And essentially that will prove that we're not aligned on the game, and things like that. So problem number one is it's very hard to capture. Creative people find it difficult to capture the idea for their game. It's incomplete. Why is it incomplete? One thing's the level, this one of detail, as I said. The other one is language. So you've got this other problem of language is either conceptual or concrete. And there's some studies that say that the more creative you are, so often the person who comes up with the idea for a game, they tend to use conceptual language. Very high level, very hard to interpret specifically. So if they're the one who comes up with the idea for the game and it's their job to communicate it to the next person, like a producer or a designer or someone else who's going to get closer to implementation, already it's imperfect because the language those people tend to use, I'm generalizing here, but that's what the study says, is very conceptual. They deal in ambiguous, hard to interpret language. The third problem, and it's specific to the video game industry, if we were making a car or a washing machine, usually they deal with functional things. It has to do A, B, C, D. And so the language you use naturally is often concrete. It has to do these program cycles, whatever it might be. Right? Video games are all about the experience. And as soon as you get to the language of experience, what is it? My work in particular, I spend a lot of time speaking to developers, trying to get evidence that this is a problem. They find it very difficult to describe what is the feeling of the game. So I'll ask simple questions like, how does that make the player feel? How does your game feel different to a competitor? And they find that really, really difficult to articulate. So you've got these multiple problems going on. Why is vision difficult to capture? We're only on stage one at the minute, which is capturing the vision. One is, what goes into the vision? What do I put in to describe it? What have I left out? It's incomplete to begin with.
Just to back you up a little bit, I often interview game developers quite a lot, and I will ask a question. I won't be ever as basic as this, but like, tell me about your game or what's your game. And then there is often a follow-up question. I'm like, yeah, but what does that mean? It's like, and sometimes it will require the PR to sort of give me a sort of quite a specific example in order for me to create. And I get what you're talking about now. And it's actually a very common thing. I end up saying, what does that mean? Because you've given me a high-end vision, but I don't understand what you're talking about. But anyway,
I shouldn't point fingers too much, but this is public. So I listened to Ken Levine talk about his new game, and at the end of the description, before he'd finished speaking, I felt, I've no idea what you're making. I've no idea what that game is. And at the end of the conversation, he said, oh, I didn't do a good job of explaining that. Go to this other place where I said it better. So even the creator of the game, again, this is not uncommon, he said, I just didn't do a very good job explaining my game. And that game's, 10 years in the making now?
Yes.
Or something like that? So, so this is, again, he's not unusual of it. This is repeated many, many times. But the theory and the previous research in this field, in team mental models, completely predicts this. And it tells you all the variables, all the things you need to do to counteract this, the level of the problem, the conceptual language. And on top of that, we have this particular problem in video games is we deal with experiences. But when I speak to developers, so you got this conceptual at one stage, we're making a cool, exciting, engaging, insert ambiguous word here type of game. The other type of thing is they deal with concrete language. And so if I ask, well, why is that interesting to play or something like that? They immediately jump to something concrete and they talk about a feature, some feature it has. But then I'll ask a simple question like, well, why is that feature interesting to play with? What does that do to the player at a human level? And they've no idea. They can't explain it. They jump back to the conceptual language again. It's cool, or it's exciting, it's tense. So they have this problem of they don't really know they maybe have it in their head with the feeling they're trying to communicate. They think they know, but they can't communicate this feeling in a way that transfers reliably. So that's problem number one. All of those things is about the capturing the problem, the level, the conceptual language, this idea that we deal with experiences and not features, although they want to talk about that. The problem it has is you have to communicate it. And problem number two says, you've all that stuff to begin with. If I have to communicate it, you've all those problems to deal with, right? On top of that, you're communicating to someone. So Chris, I'm going to tell you my idea, but me and you are not the same. I'm an organizational psychologist, and you're a world-class journalist with different experiences. We do different things. So you're trying to interpret my imperfect idea to begin with. So if you've got any ambiguity in the transmission of this idea, and you'll fill that in with what you think I meant. So because this idea is kind of imperfect and it's got gaps in it, the people who receive it are trying to fill in what they think based on their experience. And so this is very difficult, right? What is actually being communicated here? And this leads to the third problem is, can you measure the vision? How do I know? How would I check that when I told you what I said, that we both are aligned on the same thing? And that third thing's the problem I work on, which is the vision alignment check, which is if I get a group of designers and developers in a room. When I say developers, by the way, that could be like the people who fund the game or publishers, or it's anybody involved in the team, you know. So it is a whole team problem. I'm interested in, whenever you read the description of the game or someone communicates the description of the game, what model did you build in your head of what you think is being made? How accurate did that transmit? And like, spoiler alert, I've done this over 60 times, nearly 70 now, with studios around the world, from billion-dollar companies down to indies. No team has ever been completely aligned. I have maybe 15 to 20 people on these sessions, and it hasn't happened yet where we see the results and it's like, oh, we're all making the same game.
It must be quite hard to, because there's a few examples come to mind. Oddly, I was recently in a meeting where we talked about an event that I pitched, and the event that they came back to me and sort of presented back to me was nothing like I'd said. And I was like, did you not? That's interesting. And interestingly, they'd already, when I named the event, they immediately created what they thought it was. And I think they kind of stopped listening after that. Yeah. So there was a potential, I don't know if it was telling me, but that's one thing that came to mind. But the other thing that came to mind is many, many years ago, I went to E3 and I saw the first demo of Sea of Thieves, right? The Rare game. And and they were talking about shared world experiences and stuff like that. And I remember watching this trailer. It looked amazing, sounded fantastic. And Craig Duncan, the studio head at Rare, was on the show floor. And I just said, "What do you think?" And I went, "Yeah, but what is it?" And he said, "It's a pirate game." And I was like, "Yeah, but
what's the game?
What's that mean?" And he went, "It's a pirate game." And here's the thing: I now played the game to death, and if you ask me what it is, I tell you it's a pirate game. Right? It's somewhat accurate, but it's obviously that's an example for me of you're trying to convey, because Sea of Thieves is quite unique in the sort of spectrum of video games. Like, it's an example of a game. You know, a lot of times people go, "Oh, it's like Call of Duty mixed with Magic, or it's this mixed with this." But with that game, actually, that was. I could see why he went with the pirate thing.
And that example maybe works because people have an idea in their head of what a pirate game probably already is. So at the minute, as we're speaking in May 2024, I'm in the middle of interviewing game developers around this particular problem. So I'm in the middle. I don't want to spoil any results or say anything that's incomplete, because if we speak in 2 months, I may change my mind depending on who else I speak to. But at the minute, they all have that type of idea. When I ask them when I try and deconstruct their mental model, how they think about, I'm trying to deconstruct how they think when they think about their game, right? And nearly everybody so far goes back to one singular, it's like a symbol or a placeholder is what I'm calling it at the minute. So it's a pirate game. So in their head, when they say a pirate game, what they're doing, so when I deconstruct their mental model as the conversation goes on in these interviews, they're using a placeholder like it's a pirate game. But when I try and unravel that, they've got all these other things that they're meaning in their head to themselves. They know what all this stuff is, but it's hidden. But they summarize it as, it's a pirate game. So as long as everybody unravels it in the same way in the team, you're fine. When we say pirate game, that's our shortcut to these other, 3, 4, 5 next level real values that guide us when making decisions. To counteract your story, it's not you, by the way, but a similar story could be Skull and Bones by Ubisoft. So again, one of the articles that I collected was last year, the CFO of Ubisoft made an announcement saying, yes, Skull and Bones, our pirate game, which is 7 or 8 years in development, the reason why it's not out is we're polishing it. And that was the public announcement that went out. The day later, staff anonymously put out another article speaking to journalists saying, that's not the reason the game is delayed. The underlying reason is we don't know what we're making. So here you've got Rare saying our pirate game, doing very well, thank you. Ubisoft, a pirate game, not so much. And this is the staff repeating that story saying, we don't know what we're making. So obviously this idea of, well, everyone knows what pirates is, so we know what we're making, that by itself cannot be true, because we've got Skull and Bones as an example and the staff talking publicly about it saying, we don't know what it is. Although you're saying a pirate game, what's the next level beneath that? Is it this type of pirate game? I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth. Or this type of pirate game? And there's lots of variables in between, right? We can take that in either direction. And that's what my model tries to explain is, when you say pirate, what's inside your head? What are you thinking? What's the model you're constructing? And is that model exactly the same as the people who are funding the game, or the people in co-development, or the people who sit beside you? We could take this as far as you like.
Well, it's interesting with that, because we're making an awful lot of assumptions as to why the Sea of Thieves team seemed aligned on what they were building, whereas the Ubisoft team didn't. But obviously the Ubisoft games was made in multiple different countries, right? Wasn't almost all of Sea of Thieves is made in the UK, and I think part of it was So I guess people have different concepts of pirate, particularly I think it was made even in the West. So I think they must have different concepts of what piracy and pirates are. It may be in different. As an example, it's interesting because when I presented, I was on so Sea of Thieves often does a session at EGX, and they were at EGX, and I was talking about it on the TV show Sunday Brunch, and I mentioned that I showed a clip of the game, and the presenters who don't play video games. So is this a game where you sort of you do a bit of swashbuckling, you dig for treasure, you hit other ships with cannons, that kind of thing. And I was about to sort of explain to him what the game was, and I just went, yeah. He knew it simply by looking. He said, "I get it, right?" So, but I wondered if maybe it was. Is it with what you're talking about? Is it a particular problem for those when you talk about co-development in different countries? And that's a big thing. Interesting. It's one of the things that's come out in GI Sprint. Is co-development in different countries allows you to make games around the clock, and you've got people working in different countries at different time zones, so you can keep making your game faster. But
so yes and no. Again, the short answer is, does not being in the same room make it more difficult? The answer is yes, probably. I'll explain why in a second. But, however, being in the same room does not guarantee that you have alignment either. Mm-hmm. So when I was working on the prototype of my vision alignment check, so it is 5 years in as we made it, right? Mm-hmm. In the early days, in the first year, so throughout 2019, 2020, bits of 2020, pre-COVID basically, I was flying into a game studio to try my model out, right? I didn't know if it worked, so I would do it with a team. I would fly into the team. We'd be in the same room. It's 5 questions on one side of an A4 page. I would step them through it and we'd get the answer. And the results basically showed that the teams were unaligned. So even when they were in the same building, and these teams were experienced, it was a human problem. It's all those problems I mentioned before that, they all come from different disciplines, and they're the language problem. They're interpreting these words in different ways. The model they've constructed in their heads was different depending on the role they were in and all these other problems. So it didn't really matter if you were, in the same room or not. When I did it during COVID and it went online, it's the same results. You're unaligned. But it is a bit harder, obviously, because you're less chance for correction or repair, the word is. So you want to repair your mental model, which is the more people talk and the more people are talking through the idea, I'll say, oh, Chris, no, that's not what I mean. What I meant was this. And you'll go, oh, okay, fair enough. So the more chance you have to talk, the more chance you have to repair your model, mm-hmm. right? So working hybrid or working different time zones does make that problem more difficult. However, even the ones who are in the same room, they're not. It's a lack of structure, essentially. They've no way of checking. I was going to say, it sounds weird to walk up to someone and say, what's inside your head? Like, we don't typically do that, Are you thinking what I'm thinking? We don't interrogate the accuracy of the game's vision. What tends to happen is people talk about it and they assume that it was transmitted perfectly. Yeah. And the worst case scenario, what developers are telling me is, one of the stages we know when we're misaligned is we've actually spent a load of time and money making something, and someone spots it and goes, why are you making that? That's not the game we're making. So that's the worst case scenario, right? It's got as far as production. where you're spending time and money making a feature.
I guess that's when you discover it, though, isn't it? For most studios, when they find out they're not aligned, is when they start to build the game and it starts to go wrong.
So you'd think that I've got this scale of that's the worst case scenario essentially.
Mm-hmm.
If you're seeing it in a prototype, if you've spent time and money on it. When I interviewed game developers, I'm going to look to the side here because I interviewed some game developers at the start of the year. I'll try and read out some things that came out, but what they were telling me was things like, even in the concept and pre-production stages, they were feeling that the game wasn't aligned. Like they heard people on the team say, I don't know what we're making. So they haven't made it yet. They haven't spent the time and money to go and put it into code and art and blah, 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 blah. Even at the idea stage, some people are already voicing that I'm not quite sure what we're making. Mm-hmm. So that's another indicator. Now, we're sort of moving out of, I've kind of made it sound so far like half technical problem with a bit of psychology, like, the structure's wrong or the level of the mental model or things like that. The other problem here is, if I think I don't know what we're making, I still may not feel comfortable speaking up in the studio. If I'm quite new and they've hired some famous designer, right, who's world experienced and been in the industry 20 years and made successful game X, Y, Z, am I going to tell them, I have no idea what you're talking about? You should, by the way, but that's very, very difficult. Yeah. What I'm hearing is people are saying, it's very hard to do. Yeah. And then we're in the culture of the studio, right, where they may say things like, we encourage you to speak up. Easily said, really hard to do. Really hard.
By the way, that's true of journalism. The amount, when early on in my career, not even for like the first 5 years, I'd often be in an interview and someone explained to me what they're doing and I had no idea what they're talking about. But I didn't want to look stupid, right? Mm-hmm. I didn't want to look like I was as green as I was. I tried to understand that kind of stuff. And it was actually my boss, Stuart Dinsey, who's the owner of the company. I was in an interview once, and I got confused by a certain answer, and he said to me, "Look, Chris, this is the trick every journalist uses. It also allows you to ask hard questions and not look like you're being mean. Is to say, excuse my ignorance." It was always like, see, I use it all the time for two reasons. One, if I've got a tough question I want to ask, or two, if I actually don't quite understand. So I'll try and take what they've said and try and apply it to what I think it meant. And then when they correct me, but they enjoy correcting me because it's sort of like, no, and because they want me to get it right. So yeah,
of course they do.
It happened. That used to be my big thing, particularly in the business journalism when it's such a technical speciality. But anyway, carry on. So
I would still use that, and the third reason, of course, is if there's other people in the room who I think a lot of people in here may not know what was just said. So even if I know it or if I think I've got a good understanding, I would say, no, I don't get it. Could you explain that to me again in an easier way or something? I want everyone in the room to be on the same page. So it's just like the job is the team has to be moving together. Organizational psychology is at the team level. It doesn't matter if one person knows what the vision is. All the research would say the team has to know. The team is everybody working on that game. Everybody at all levels. So that's the job. Is the team know what the game is, or is it just a few people who know what the game is? And in some cases, even the vision holder doesn't know what the game is. So the original name of this thing I created, this vision alignment check, it was originally called Game Definition Template. That's how it began. I was trying to help a designer to articulate their game in a psychological framework, essentially, to explain it to what it's doing to the player. That's where it came from. And when I was talking to developers to say, tell me about your game, tell me what you're making, tell me about the experience that's giving to the player, even the vision holder could not explain their own game in many cases. So I always found that interesting, like, they don't quite know. They maybe have something going on in their mind, but they can't get it onto a page and they can't articulate it. So this framework, the original structure of it was to say, I think I can help you get this idea out in a way that makes sense. But I did not know at the time that this was going to be used for communication or measurement or a vision or things like that. That was a kind of a fluke in a way. It's a long-winded backstory. No one cares for this part. But all these problems are related. The capturing of the idea, the communication of the idea, the measurement of the vision. They're all the same type of problem. And the fundamental principles are the same. Like, why are we wasting money? Why are we wasting time? Why is Hyena is $100 million game in 7 years in production. Why did that get canned? And then the staff say, with no clear vision, Why does that happen?
So it sounds to me like you need to get it right at the concept stage, but the challenge is, no, sometimes you might not find out till later on anyway. So that is I guess that's the bit they have to sort of nail, right?
Exactly. So whenever you look into the people who research process, like the management science, I guess, is the branch of science we're in here. So they look at where costs and where effort is spent along the development life cycle of any project, including creative or design projects. And 70% of the costs for a project are tied back to decisions made at the concept stage. Now, they're not saying that 70% of the costs are spent in concept. What they're saying is the decisions that are made during concept is impacting 70% of the total costs you will spend later on, like the size of the team, the scope of the game. You're making all those decisions at the concept stage. What are we making? What size is the project? How much do we spend on marketing? Blah, blah. Most of this stuff, you're making those big decisions there. So if you get that wrong, if you don't quite know what game you're making, what tends to happen is you will rebuild that later on once you find out, oh, that's not what we meant. We have to redo this bit again and throw this in the bin. Mm-hmm. And again, we look at the science of how much does it cost you to redo something later in development. It's about 5 to 15 times the cost you originally thought. And there's more time, by the way. So that little bit of time, you just imagined it would all be perfect. We've got the vision, we've got the scope. All we have to do is go and make it. But again, the science would say, well, you're going to get the vision wrong, as we've saw many times in the game industry, for all the reasons I said. And that's going to cause you to spend more money. That's going to cause you to spend more time. But those are the technical costs. We then have the human costs, which is you burn through the goodwill of the staff. They're now demotivated. We have to do it again. Or we told you this was going to be a problem and you didn't listen. When I was interviewing game developers around how they manage their game's vision, I mainly asked questions around what the previous research had said, which is how do you capture the vision? How do you communicate the vision? How do you measure the vision? How do you know if you're aligned? And it was all in line with what the theory said, which is it's a mess at every stage. We're bad at capturing it. We're terrible at communicating it. And we have no idea how to measure it, the alignment. But a fourth theme came out, and I didn't ask it, and everybody I interviewed talked about it. And I ended up labeling it psychology of work. What they said is because of all those first three problems, because we're misaligned, the people are experiencing friction, burnout, lack of erosion of trust and things like that. And it has led to project cancellations. And other factors as well, which I'll not go into. They told personal stories as well, of course. So all of those, this is not just a technical thing, we're wasting time and money. This is, we're ruining the culture of the studio. We're ruining people's lives, essentially. Mm-hmm. That people are unnecessarily experiencing conflict. Why is the conflict happening? It's because we don't know what we're making and they're butting heads against each other to try and correct the problem. So again, this vision problem, why I spent 5 years working on it is it's not just one problem like, you should know what you're making is not a nice idea. It's directly tied to the time you take, the amount of money you spend, the creativity of a project, we'll maybe get to that, and the psychology of the culture of that team and studio. Mm-hmm. All of these things are directly linked back to that one single root cause. So that's why all the evidence says this is the most important thing to a successful team. It's because it impacts nearly everything that a team does.
Yeah. Well, it's sitting on that sort of early stage part of it. We're talking about speeding up development. And obviously you're talking about, you need to get that alignment right. So I guess you'd spend more time at the start would be a piece of advice that you'd give maybe. But is it possible to spend... Oh, go on.
I was going to say, not necessarily more time. I think just check that everyone's interpreting the vision in the same way. So, for example, when I speak to developers, some of the stories that are coming out is they're spending a long time in concept, but it's not getting any clearer. So they're already spending a lot of time. And so if I ask a question like, well, why are you spending a lot of time in concept? Is it longer than you expected? And they would say, yes, it's longer than we expected. Why is that? And the answer is, we don't know what we're making. So we're going around in circles and there's no process to actually check, are we working towards a goal? Like, are we working towards a vision, or are we just going around in circles for a long time? And the answer from a lot of them is we're going around in circles for a long time. So I'm not necessarily saying you need to spend more time in concept, because I think people are doing that, but they're not getting any better. It's how do you know when you're spending time in concept that you're working towards an aligned vision? That's the bit I want you to get to. Are you reaching a consensus on this is the game we're making? Or are you continually fighting for what is the game? And it's that second one a lot of people are spending time in. In fact, that's one I made we'll look to the side here for a second, but I made this list. I'll probably give this away at some point. Like, it's called potential signs that your team might be misaligned. And the first one on this list is, I feel we are taking longer than expected to find the vision. So time by itself is not the solution. Other ones include, there are repeating discussions with minimal progress around which features should be in or out of the game. These are almost phrases directly from the developers, by the way, or the people I interviewed. It is not clear if we are making progress on delivering the game's vision. So if you're spending time in concept, but you feel you're making progress, that's fine. Mm-hmm. But if you feel you're in an endless cycle, then that's unhealthy. And the last one in this particular, here's a sign that you might be misaligned during concept. I feel the vision is not well understood equally by all parts of the team. And this is across silos, stakeholders, or partners. So if you're in codev, for example, or you've got a publisher or whatever it may be, so someone across some type of boundary, is the vision equal? Is it understood equally by everyone on the team or parts of the team? Again, this is a team sport that we're participating in. So you cannot have it that, we're fine because one person or one silo knows what we're doing. Just one example, not recently, there was an article about the ex-CEO of Square Enix North America. And he was saying the biggest problem he saw when he came to Square Enix North America was that we need to understand what the vision for the game is. And that's his words. But he said in particular, where he saw the conflict was the conflict was between the people who create the vision for the game, let's call them developers or creatives, and the business side, as he called it, something like that. So but what he was getting at is it's not enough anymore just to say this is a good idea. That idea has to be business viable. It has to reach a big enough market. And he said something like, basically, developers don't think like business people. So they think, is it a good idea? Is it a good idea? Is it a good idea? And he's like, well, that's part of the equation. Mm-hmm. The vision, the full vision for the game is, it's a good idea that can be played by enough of an audience to make the business work. Yeah. And he was seeing that conflict. This is the psychology of work again, between the particular silo of a good idea is enough. Some people have that belief. But the market will tell you, as we know, a good idea by itself is not necessarily a good business. A good vision may be two visions which come together. The vision for the business and the vision for the creative idea, essentially.
You talked about boundaries. And I guess we're living in a world where you're starting to see more and more game developers we talk about remote working, but not just that. They're often not part of it. Often have like 2 or 3 people at the center of the company, maybe more. And then they, bring in some outside devs and freelancers and contractors to work on bits of the game. I guess that makes alignment so much more important, I guess, in those situations. But it sounds to me like we as an industry aren't ready for that. Is it?
The evidence is, in line with that. We're finding it difficult, is what the evidence says. Lots of stories of conflict, failure, games being shuttered, studios being shuttered. So the trend, you're right, is that the industry wants to outsource or use distributed teams. Mm-hmm. But the evidence also says that we find that difficult to communicate the idea for the game. It's not going well for us. So that's an interesting space. How do we deal with this problem?
Well, how do it go? What are there best practices that you've got?
There isn't.
This is not a very helpful podcast.
It's not. Yeah. So again, I'll probably give my solution, if you want to call it that. I'll probably give it away. So I'll probably write a book next year. I work with studios already doing this, but the idea I'll probably give away at some point. But that's what surprised me when I was asking studios around, how do you solve this problem internally? And then I would ask, but is this working for you? And they're like, no, none of these things work. So we've all these ideas around, what makes a team aligned on a vision. And nothing's really working well. because of all those problems we began with, the conceptual language that people find difficult to communicate. How do you know if the idea was transmitted? And so this vision alignment check, I'll probably write it up and try and give that away to the game industry in some form, because there's nothing else quite like it. That's what surprised me, that I thought surely would have some way of knowing. How do I know that the thing that's in my head is what's inside the other 100 people in this team, the other 200 people in this team? Or in Skull and Bones case, the other 1,000 people in this team, maybe. Are we all interpreting this the same way? And is the player interpreting that the same way? Do they know what we're making? This is the marketing angle on this as well, right? Is at some point, it's good if the team knows what we're making, but it's good if the player knows too. Can I really tell you? Back to you both of us were saying we're listening to people talk about their game and we're thinking, why would I play that? You've just done a really bad job of convincing me to stop playing something else and play this game. Why is that?
Yeah, well, it's often you get it. I think it's a lot better these days. But you used to have it where you talk about it you're talking about development, we're talking about speeding up development, but obviously from the marketing and publishing side, the amount of times the game's being pitched as one thing and it isn't that at all. Like was very common. Certainly, I think it still happens, but it's very common in the early days of the games industry. You're being marketed a game that's like this, and it turns out to be something quite different.
I don't want to appear unhelpful in the podcast, so what I'll say is, if I think if you want to do something, I know this is difficult, you need to challenge. If you think you're not aligned on the vision of the game, this is a leadership problem. I wasn't sure if this would come up, if we should talk about it, but a culture needs to be created where it is completely okay, not even okay, it's encouraged to say it is to everyone's benefit in this room, creatively, commercially, mentally, like any metric you want to measure. If we can say that I don't quite know what the game is we're making, and I should be able to challenge that. Some of the people I talked to said, we did do a good job on aligning the vision. And at the end of the conversation, after listening to them talk about it, I would say things like, I've listened to you talk about the alignment on the vision. I don't think you were. And they said, oh yeah, actually we weren't. So they thought somehow that they were, but during the conversation, what it turns out is the only bits they were aligned on were the more concrete parts, like the art or the music or the story. Something you can point to and go, do you want this art or that art? Or should the audio be like this or that? But ultimately, when I would go deeper into what's the actual experience of the game, everybody was talking about, we can't communicate. We're bad at communicating that. We do it in an inconsistent way. We drift over time. We don't know how it's interpreted. We don't know what people heard. And we're only finding out about it when it's too late. Whenever we see it, what they've implemented in the game, and we realise that that's not what we meant. We couldn't catch that sooner. So the simple way of catching it sooner is at least talk about it. But again, the problem I'm seeing is that that's unstructured. And the vision alignment check, what I was trying to do is, I think you need a specific structure. And mine's structured, there's only 5 questions, but they're very specifically structured to force your mind to go into to answer the questions in a certain way that allows brings out the differences essentially.
I think you said to me before, you need the you can run as fast as you can, but if you're running in the wrong direction, right, you're onto a losing, you're not going to get there faster. You might.
This is a common. Yeah. Sorry, I interrupted.
No, you needed to, because I wasn't just going to waffle on.
No, I hear this pushback a lot, which is, we're too busy. We just have to go and make it. But, how do you? If you're just going faster but going in different directions, you're making things worse. That'll have to be undone at some stage and done again. And so trying to get us back to culture as well. There's lots of issues here, to be honest. Some people, like identity, some people think, I've had a success in the past, I know what I'm doing. I find I have to tell my team, that I don't know what I'm doing, that reflects on me. I don't want to deal with that. So I'll appear confident and just say we're going this direction. So there's lots of factors that can impact on this decision. But it's potentially leading to maybe bad leadership, potentially in some cases. But also, again, there is no measure. The final thing, what you were making me think about there is, yes, so speed without direction is not speed. That's what you need to take away from that. You need to have the direction first, and then when you've got direction, you will definitely you might get speed. The other story that springs to mind around So both of these sound counterintuitive because I'm basically advising you to stop to save time. And a lot of people struggle with that idea. Stop? What are you talking about? We're far too busy to stop and do something when we've got a production pipeline we're already crunching in some cases. The two stories that spring to mind where stopping helped the studio. One is Zelda, Breath of the Wild. This was an article on Edge like nearly a decade ago. So they were trying to make Breath of the Wild, and they had to borrow 100 extra team members from another department or something to help make the game, to get it done on time for the launch of the Switch. So it must have been, 7 years ago? Whatever it was. And what they said is, the natural thing would have been, we're busy, just work faster, work harder. But when they brought these 100 extra people onto the team, what they did is they stopped and played the game every few days to share knowledge. So the team would play the game together. So they called it, I think, horizontal information sharing. And there's lots of psychology that says this works. All this stuff behind me. Basically saying this knowledge sharing is one of your greatest assets. Sharing knowledge. It's also called team mental models. Doesn't matter, you can look it up if you want. But basically the more I know you and the more you know me, the better that team gets. So when I said aligning on the vision, that's called task mental model. Do we know where we're going? The team mental model is how well are we performing as a team to work towards that destination? So you have task and team mental models. What Nintendo were doing there is building up their team mental model. I know you work in art, for example. So if I'm working on this thing, I think this might affect you. Because I know you and how you work and what you're doing, I will give you a heads up that this may impact you. We're now working more efficiently. Or I think I need to change this. I'm a programmer. I will let production know. I know they're dealing with this problem. If you don't know what your team members are working on, how they work and the problems, the knowledge isn't flowing around the company. So the idea of just working in your own little silo, I do art, leave me alone and I'll do the art. I do audio, I do program. The evidence is completely against that. You need to build up a team mental model. And one easy way of doing that, I say easy, is to stop and play your game as a team, not individually, as a team, and sit beside each other. So art sitting beside, programming, sitting beside production, sitting beside QA, sitting beside the CEO, sitting beside marketing. When they're all looking at the same thing and saying, oh, that's the game you're making. I've heard all these stories, by the way. But when a team sits together and I just listen for the information that's being shared, like, why is that coming to light now? Shouldn't that have been talked about a year ago or 2 years ago? So that means the information is not being shared around the company. Mm-hmm. The other one is CD Projekt Red, where they had lots of success for Witcher 3, top of the world. Then they released Cyberpunk 2077. Let's call that a disaster financially and critically. Then they made Phantom Liberty, which is back up again. And when Phantom Liberty was a success again, the DLC, GameSpot went into the studio to ask them that question. What happened? How did you recover from this massive failure? And I'll cut it short. They basically said, we stopped and played the game as a team. Now, we could talk about the science of why that works. Why does knowledge sharing work, blah, blah, blah. But it doesn't matter. Essentially what's happening there is when we stop and we share knowledge, we are reflecting on partly what's actually happening with situational awareness. Are we aware of what situation we're actually in? Am I communicating that situation? And you're also reflecting on what's actually happening, the processes. Why did it get to that state? What are we doing that led to this happening to begin with? That's called double loop learning. Mm. And most of the game industry is in single loop learning. Single loop learning means I know how to do a thing. I will learn how to be 5% better, 1% better. Getting better at your craft. You're not really questioning, you're more optimizing. Double loop learning is you're questioning the question. I'm not going to get better at it. I'm going to ask, why do we do that to begin with? Hmm. So I've done this with studios in the past. At the end of the workshops, it's like, oh, I see. We shouldn't be doing that at all. It's like, probably not. So they're not getting 1% better. Now they're getting hundreds of percent better because they've had the time to stop and think about, why do we do that? That makes no sense. But because they're so busy, you're just busy doing. You're not busy thinking. Yeah. So double loop learning, again, it sounds counterintuitive. Stopping usually is the way to create lots of time at the end, further in development.
Yeah.
Anyway,
it's my managerial feedback to some members of my team who I won't name, who are often they often ask when people ask me how do I get to the level I've got at, and I said, one thing I do a lot is I spend a lot of time wandering about and thinking.
Who would have thought that that's very effective?
And I said, I feel super counted. Like I should be writing and I should be emailing. I'm like, well,
No.
I need to know what I'm emailing. I need to know who I'm emailing. I need to know why I'm asking that question. I need to know whether or not that's a waste of time or whether it's worth. And it's like all of that. I spend a lot of time but I do also do a lot as well. But it's often so I think this is really fascinating. I'm really conscious of the time. I was going to ask what happens when something does change in development. If the game they're making turns out actually somebody launches a similar thing, it doesn't do very well, and they have to pivot and change. But I don't know how big a answer that will be.
So oddly enough, I'm in the middle of interviewing game developers to see how they think when they think about their game.
Mm-hmm.
And again, there's a mini spoiler in some way. One of my propositions going in, one of my ideas going in is that I think they're going to find it hard to pivot whenever a competitor comes out or someone says we have to cut 10 million from the budget, or we want you to make that game in 6 months less, whatever it may be. Basically something that causes you to change, essentially. I think they find that hard, and I think it's hard for them to do because they don't actually know what their game is. Mm-hmm. Because of this underlying problem that you think either conceptually hard to interpret or worse, oddly, very concrete. We're making these features. Well, I don't want you to make those features. That's too expensive. What are you going to change it to? Well, we don't know, but we can just throw things at the wall until that works. The model I'm working on, let's say, is in the middle. This is the spoiler alert. My model sits between conceptual, high level, hard to interpret, concrete, so fixed that it's hard to change. I'm saying I think you can do the best of both, which is you can communicate it and it'll explain what you're making, but it'll also explain how you can change, how you can take one feature out and add another feature in, but keep the feeling of the game the same. And so I'm essentially gathering the evidence that says this other way of thinking will help you to pivot and change and counteract all the other problems we talked about in the beginning, the capturing the model, the communication, the measurement.
And when will the research be complete, do you think?
Soon.
Basically, when should people be giving you a call and saying? I've
been working on this for 5 years, but this is more. I keep adding more rigor around the model, so I'm changing everything every few months, based on new evidence or new information. But so I'd already have been doing this, and no doubt people listening. It's been through 60 studios, so a lot of people have seen some version of it. A lot of studios have been through it. But.
Well, I'm sort of out of questions. We're sort of running quite out of time. Is there anything that we've not touched upon that you wanted to bring up?
I don't think. I just want to say that this keeps coming up. This idea of how do we create more time? How do we create more? How do you make games cheaper? And I think we're seeing the state of the game industry in 2024 is mass layoffs, and 2023, and. I think this problem, the why I spent so long working on it, is it's tapping into all those types of things. I think games can be made faster and cheaper, and the underlying reason why we're seeing them take so long is everything points to we're not quite sure what we're making. Mm-hmm. It's called a substantive problem. This thing we're talking about, it comes up number one on the list, and it's been number one on the list in terms of team performance for nearly 4 decades. So when I kept going back in time, when did this problem keep coming up? It's been there since the birth of teamwork. Teams is quite it's about a 40-year-old concept, 80s and 90s. Before that was groups, which is single people doing their thing, but they're in the same building. But teams is, I need to rely on you to make the game. You've got a skill set, and I've got a skill set. And together, we need each other to make this game. So teamwork is 40-ish years old. And since the beginning of people researching teams, this problem of being aligned on the same problem has topped the list in terms of the leading factor of success. So it's just odd that it's been, the game industry, not just the game industry, most industries still don't have a clear solution to this problem.
People, they're the problem.
It's a people problem. It's a human problem. Yeah. And the reason is, even if you're aligned, we could even talk about culture. You could be completely aligned, but you could have a leader who just says, I don't want to do it. Not interested. Which is, we could talk about hiring then, or the culture of the studio, or, there's an underlying assumption here that people want to be aligned, essentially.
Yeah.
You want to make a good game. That's the underlying assumption.
Yeah. Well, take a game like Anthem's a great example, right? Of a game made by a studio that's typically turns out hits and big successful games. So something went wrong along the way on that. we're out of time. We could talk for so much more.
Well, Chris, thanks very much.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you for taking part in this in this project. And everyone listening or watching, if you're watching on YouTube, stay tuned for more from GI Sprint over the coming days and weeks. If you want to make sure you don't miss a beat, do sign up to the GI newsletter, which you can find at GamesIndustry.biz / newsletters. Until then, thank you, Graham, again. Pleasure to have you, and thank you all for tuning in.